a million of Kehillas have joined together, million of Rabbonim, Yasher Koach to all the Rabbonim of those shuls for us joining together for this amazing program. We have over 550 people that have joined us for the program this evening. So thank you for joining, and thank you to all the Kehillas for participating. A reminder, tomorrow we have the great privilege of hearing from Rabbi Yosef Elephant of the Mir Yeshiva, one of the great speakers in the English-speaking Torah world today. And that's at 11 o'clock. I did post the link to register for that on the chat. So if you haven't done so yet, please join us. Don't miss Rabbi Elephant tomorrow. I ask Rabbi Hendler to introduce Rabbi Spiro for us. Rabbi Hendler, over to you.
Okay, if I can just also share the words of Rabbi Saxton, that it's so wonderful to have unity and so many communities together over here tonight, and my wonderful colleagues, senior colleagues and friends. On Yom Kippur, on Tisha B'av, it's truly a special time to have this type of unity. And I was actually just thinking that, normally on Tisha B'av, we each have our own community and we have a very meaningful time, but it's very rare. It's almost a gift that we're able to spend Tisha B'av together in a sense of achdus, in a sense of togetherness. I feel very grateful and very privileged for that. And as Rabbi Danny said, Rabbi Spiro is so well known to all of us. In fact, he mentioned to me a couple of weeks ago that he's been to South Africa at least 18 times. And that excludes all of the Zoom meetings that he's had. I just want to say one tiny thing. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was reading through his history book, and truly inspirational, succinct, and really capturing the essence of the periods of Jewish history. And I just remember my own Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Goldfein Zatzal, often used to say, if you don't know where you come from, you cannot know where you are going to. And I think it is an incredible avoider that he has brought to us of making Jewish history accessible, of giving thousands of Jews all over the world an incredible sense of where they come from, and that therefore lays down the groundwork for where we are going to. And therefore, perhaps it's fitting that Ken is talking to us, Rabbi Spiro is talking to us tonight from Yerushalayim, from Ira Kodesh, which is Ki Mitzion Tetzeh Torah, where Torah and Nevuah comes from. That's where all of the great Nevi'im were. That's where all of the learning of Torah took place. And he's going to share with us a vision for the future of the prophecy and the end of days, and how we understand that, and how we can understand the future of the Jewish people and the world. So we are honored and privileged to have Rabbi Ken Spiro with us, and without further ado, it's our great pleasure to ask him to present.
Good evening, and thank you, Rabbi Saxton, and thanks, Rabbi Hendler, for the introduction. I've been doing a lot of, even though I'm kind of isolated here, and actually I'm not just in Jerusalem, but in the old city of Jerusalem. The image behind me I actually took during the height of the Corona shutdown in March, when you can see the Jaffa Gate is actually closed and there's no one even outside the old city. So I think it's quite fitting that I'm speaking to you from there. The topic that was chosen tonight to talk about, I think, is extremely relevant, because it's about getting the bigger picture. We Jews introduced a transformative idea, the notion of a God who acts in history, but that also the time has power and energy. The Shabbat is an opportunity to grow and connect and rejuvenate, all puns intended, on that day that you cannot do the other 6 days of the week, and holidays, Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot. There's different specific opportunities for growth. Even fast days are tremendous opportunities, not just for introspection and for feeling down and sad, and of all the sad fasts, Tisha B'av and Yom Kippur, the two 24-hour, 25-hour fasts we have. But on Yom Kippur, we know we're not fasting because we're mourning. We're fasting because we're on such a high level spiritual. We're not thinking about the physical world. But Tisha B'av is an incredibly heavy day. I point out when I'm talking about the history of Tisha B'av that actually some of these fast days should have really been happy days. The 17th of Tammuz should have been the day when Moses came down Mount Sinai, having brought us out of Egypt and finally giving us that Torah, and instead we get the golden calf and what went from a day of tremendous opportunity, tremendous day of sadness. Tisha B'av is the exact same thing. It should have been probably one of the happiest days, along with the 17th of Tammuz, because that should have been the day when the spies, having scattered out the land, returned and said, just as God promised Abraham and just as he said it would be, we can now enter the land, fulfill our destiny. We have the Jewish people with our software package, the Torah, in the unique land of Israel, the only place we can actualize our destiny. Should have been an amazing day. Unfortunately, because of the Lashon Hara, the Dibat Haaretz, bad-mouthing the land, it turned a day of tremendous positive potential turns into a tremendously sad day. And as God said on that day, you're crying on this day for no good reason. I'll give you what to cry about. We see that so many terrible things have happened on the 9th of Av: destruction of First Temple, Second Temple, the fall of Beitar during the Bar Kokhba revolt, the expulsion of Jews from Spain, the start of World War I, when Germany declares war on Russia, which is really this, without World War I, there wouldn't be World War II, so no Holocaust, and the list goes on and on and on. So we definitely have what to cry about on this day, but I want to pull all of you back and focus on the big picture, because we need to stand back and realize, where do we fit in? And we're very close to the end of the story. We're in a very difficult time in human history between coronavirus, all the political instability. I'm originally from the States, although I've been in Israel for 38 years. What's going on in the Western world is a bit crazy. So we want to get us a little bigger perspective. We have an opportunity on Tisha B'av, not just to be sad, but to focus, to take the time to think individually and collectively, what is it that we need to do so that we can ensure that we never have any other terrible event to add to the list of tragedies that fell out on this day. And more importantly than that, the rabbis, you'll see, Tisha B'av, as sad as it is, we don't do tachanun. There's certain things we don't do that are associated with sadness on Tisha B'av, because we're told that ultimately it will be a day of joy and gladness and happiness, the way it was supposed to be originally. And what I really want to leave everyone with is not only a big sense of where we're going, how close we are to the end, but most importantly, what we should really be focusing in the next 23, 24 hours, depending when the fast only came in here. We're in the summertime here. I know you guys are in the winter. But for the about 24 hours we have left, what we should focus on individually and collectively. So I'm going to do a presentation called The Edge of History. It has to do with prophecy in the end of days. I have it as a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to be sharing my screen for the remainder of the time. So let me do the screen share. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. I hope our host can enable that. I'm not sure who's in charge of this, but hopefully that will work.
It should be done any second. It'll be coming around now.
Okay, perfect. There it is. Thank you very much, Rabbi. Okay, we'll share this. Make that big, and we will go. Okay. So everyone should, as we say, hang on to your hats. This is a very meaty presentation. There's a lot to it. And I'm sure you'll find it very, I don't use the word enjoyable, but hopefully very insightful and hopefully very impactful. There's an old Chinese curse that says, you should live in interesting times. And like I said before, we're living in very interesting times. And the question is, where are we going? How close are we towards the end? What does prophecy have to say about what's going on right now? Now, I have to give a little disclaimer at the beginning. I don't know when the Messiah is coming. If I knew that, I would be a prophet. Now, as a prophet, I'd be working in the stock exchange and I wouldn't be a teacher. But by the end of this presentation, I think you'll all have a much better sense of how close we are, and we are pretty close to the end. But before we get to the end, we have to go back to the beginning. So let's start with a little bit of an introduction, because before you fill in a jigsaw puzzle, you got to put the frame in. So I'm going to outline the big picture with the broadest brushstrokes, the Jewish view of basically time and our destiny and our role in that story. So to begin at the beginning, Jewish time begins, year one for Judaism is actually the sixth day of creation, which is Friday. The lesson we learn from the fact that we start from day 6 and not day 1, because day 1 would be in scientific terms the Big Bang, is that the focus of creation is us. A big Hollywood movie director, he may take a lot of time to set up the stage, but he doesn't start filming until the actors come on the set. So just as the camera focuses on the actors, Judaism teaches fundamental point of Jewish worldview, the focus of creation is us. But when the director says action with the clapboard, the actors have their lines. So what are our lines? What's the purpose of creation? Why are we here? So I'm doing a really quick version of this. If you want the detailed version, you have to go read Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal's book, Mesilat Yesharim, The Path of the Just. He explains this beautifully. But the purpose of creation, Judaism says, is pleasure. And the greatest pleasure there is, because not all pleasures are alike. You can listen to a class done by my Rosh Yeshiva. I think you can probably access it on aish.com or maybe Aish Audio. But there's different levels of pleasure. The class is called the 5 levels of pleasure. Lowest level pleasure is physical pleasure, but the highest level pleasure is connection to God. The Hebrew word is dvekut. Nothing comes close to that. And that was originally what the whole story of creation was originally about. God puts humanity in a perfect environment, that's the Garden of Eden, taking care of all of our needs so we can focus all of our attention and all of our time on achieving that highest level pleasure. Why have physical pleasure like eating an ice cream when you can have transcendence? It should have been the shortest, most straightforward story. But we know that having a relationship with an infinite being is not easy. Anyone who prays 3 times a day knows exactly what I'm talking about. And the early narrative in the Bible is people found it way too hard to have a relationship with that infinite being. But because we all experience moments of awe that are almost all related to experiencing things in nature, like a beautiful sunset and the stars and a thunderstorm and the beautiful vision of the sun setting over the ocean and mountains. So people eventually ended up worshiping the forces in nature as a way of indirectly connecting with God. And what happened? They basically, after a few generations, forgot about God and worshiped the forces in nature, which is the worst thing you can do. That's idolatry. It's not bad because you hurt God. We don't help God. We don't hurt God. We have to get it out of our minds that we do anything for God. He doesn't need us to keep kosher or Shabbat or anything like that. But to have a relationship with an idol, which is an illusion, is to like be married to a non-existent person or spend your life with nothingness. That's what happens. The world goes in tremendous decline. Relationship with God is lost. Purpose of creation is lost. God tries to salvage it with the flood story with Noah's Ark. That doesn't work. The world bottoms out at the Tower of Babel story where humanity unites, but for all the wrong reasons. What do we call that today? General Assembly of the United Nations. Back then we called it the Tower of Babel. But back then they unite to rebel against God. And just when it looks like it's hopeless because everyone seems to be blowing it, along comes one man, Abraham, who is really great for 2 reasons. And he will change the entire course of human history. Abraham is the ultimate power of one story, the ability of one human being to change the entire destiny of human history. I say, number one, in a world that is, worshiping idols, Abraham is an incredible, radically transformative thinker, able to think outside the box and connect to an infinite, invisible being when the whole world is worshiping idols. Imagine being the only person to be doing that, to be pushing an idea which is completely incomprehensible and unacceptable that most people would kill you for. How many of us would have the chutzpah to even whisper to their best friends? But that's the real greatness of Abraham. He says, I don't care. I want truth regardless of consequences. And he dedicates himself to unique responsibility, which until today is the national historic mission of us, the Jewish people, this chosen people thing. And how do I explain it simply? Abraham says to God, God, I choose you. I choose to dedicate my life and the life of my descendants to one mission, to teaching the world about the reality of you and the values that come from relationship with you. And God says back to Abraham, you're choosing me, then I choose you back, Abraham, you and your descendants, us, the Jewish people. What are we chosen for? It's not privilege. We're chosen for responsibility. What's the responsibility? The word we love to use, often misuse and overuse, is tikkun olam, fix the world. How's that for a cause? A little bigger than save the whales? But the real job of being Jewish, which we should really spend this day thinking about, is Kiddush Hashem. Kiddush Hashem, which is living and acting in a way individually and collectively that will inspire other people. We're the God Squad. People are supposed to look at us and say, look at those Jews. Look at how they live, how happy they are. Look at their families, their communities, how they do business. Look at how they run their country. What's their secret? Our job is to get humanity back to that relationship with God. and the national historic mission of the Jewish people, and ultimately the entire plot of human history is all centered around this plot. All of humanity is in the story. Every human being has a place. There's no one on the planet who doesn't serve a purpose. But because of the decisions that Abraham made and the responsibility he chose for us, like the lead actors in a movie, a unique central role in the story despite our teeny little size. So humanity returns to God, Jewish people lead the way, is the plot of the whole story. So now that we know the purpose of creation is relationship with God, but humanity blew it, and the Jewish people's job since Abraham has been get humanity back to the garden, so to speak. Now we just have to talk about how long the story takes and where are we in the story, and then we can talk about the prophecy. So the Talmud in Sanhedrin, page 97a, makes a very interesting statement. It says the world is to exist for 6,000 years, which doesn't mean from the Big Bang to the end of time is 6,000 years. No. It means from the end of day 6, and if you follow my good friend, Dr. Gerald Schroeder, who's got a double PhD, his mother's so happy, double PhD in nuclear physics and oceanography, and he's written 4 books on science and Torah. He does an amazing job of crunching the science into the Torah, and we had the science before science had the science. But from the end of day 6, which could be one very long day, to the end of normative history, which is what we're experiencing now, is a maximum of 6,000 years. Okay, and then the Talmud goes on to explain, in the first 2,000 years there was desolation, 2,000 years the Torah flourished, and the next 2,000 years of the Messianic era. But through our many iniquities, all these years have been lost. I'll now explain what that means by demonstrating our little timeline. So we said, day 1 is the creation of human beings. Okay, we have, someone's unmuted there. We have a 2,000-year period. Now, where does the 6 come from in 6,000? Just as the 6 days of the week, we have a 7th day we'll talk about, but the 6 days, normative days of the week, are mirroring the 6 days of creation. Every millennia, every 1,000 years is equivalent to a day of a week. Remember, Jewish weeks begin on Sunday. It's one of the only things I miss living in Israel. Everything's gotten so great here. The ice cream, the wine, even the toilet paper is good now. When I first came here, none of that was so good. But no Sunday. The Monday morning blues begin on Sunday because it's, in Hebrew, called Yom Rishon, the first day. So we're being told that the first 2 days are equivalent to the first 2 millennia, 2,000 years. That's called desolation. They borrow the term, the rabbis borrow the term tohu uvohu from the second sentence in the book of Genesis. There it's talking about when there was no physical world. Here we're just talking about, we call the first 2,000 years, which is from Adam to Abraham, in terms of how much time it takes up, the period of time when there's no relationship with God. So it's desolate spiritually. The next 2,000 years are going to go from Abraham till the year 240 of the Common Era, which is actually a little bit after the writing of the Mishnah, but significantly after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 on the 9th of Av. That's called Torah. That's sort of the Jewish national experience initially, when we as a unique people, hardware with a unique Torah software, live as a unique nation in the world before there's any other monotheistic faiths. The last 2,000 years are not the Messianic era, so to speak, although some Christians might think it's the case, but rather the plot of the last 2,000 years is that humanity will return to God with the Jewish people lead the way. And by the way, if you overlay what really happened in history over this, that's exactly what's happened. In the last about 1,800 years, we've seen the greatest spiritual and moral transformation in human history, where today billions of people whose ancestors used to be a bunch of amoral pagans now believe in a world that's essentially Jewish. Who am I talking about? Christians and Muslims who bought into, okay, now they think they've replaced us, separate topic, but they more or less bought into that Jewish worldview. That is a tremendous transformation. But since we're talking about the end of days, we want to focus on that last 2,000-year period called Messiah. Okay, which is where humanity returns to God. And this period is divided. Imagine this is Thursday and Friday. This period is divided into a subsection that appears at the end, because you have normative history. And as you get to the end, like Friday, when you get to Friday, late afternoon, before the sun goes down, you have, or when the sun goes down, before the stars come out, you have a transformative period called the Messianic era. It's amazing how many Jews, by the way. One thing I've learned teaching for many, many years is lack of knowledge doesn't stop a lot of people and a lot of Jews from voicing opinions on things they don't know anything really about. I've had so many people tell me Messiah is not a Jewish concept. It absolutely is. We brought the idea into the world. Christianity took it from us, changed the definition, use it against us, and don't pay us any royalties for it. But it's totally a Jewish idea. But I'm not going to do a class on Messiah now. But Messiah, this idea of Messiah, he's a catalyst, like in chemistry. His job, what does a catalyst do? Speeds up a process. He is a human being with certain lineage and leadership skills and Torah knowledge, whose job it is to speed up the process and prepare humanity to enter the 7th millennia, which is equivalent to Shabbat of human history, which is not called Shabbat in history as it's called in the 7th day of the week. It's called Olam Haba. Olam Haba, the world to come, is not where you go when you're dead. What's death? Death is separation of the soul from the body. When a person dies, the soul separates from the body, like you get a new phone, right? What do you do with the old phone? You don't want the actual phone. You want what's on the phone, the contents. That's the soul. That goes to the cloud. Okay? This gets recycled back to the whatever. So too, the body goes back to the ground. The soul goes up to Olam HaNishamot, the soul world. And if you earned enough points down here, because that's what it's all about, you're put in a body, a soul's put in a body because you're your soul. So you can choose, being pulled in different directions. The ultimate godlike thing we do is choose. If you make enough right choices and you earn enough points or put enough money in your spiritual bank account, you get to hang out up there and have that highest level pleasure that I mentioned. But if not, you can get recycled back down to here so you can try again to make more choices, which is a simple way of talking about what? Transmigration of souls, reincarnation, Gilgul Nishamot, which is a Jewish idea. Christianity doesn't have it. By the way, that means if you're here now, you've been here before. If you want to know who you were before, you can either come to Israel or invite to come speak in South Africa. I don't think he's ever been. Good friend of mine, co-founder with me of the Aish Russian program in 1990, Rabbi Dr. Yefim Svirsky. Born in Moscow, raised in Toronto, living in Israel the last 30 years, who will, for a reasonable amount of money, although it's a lot of rand, regress you through hypnosis into who you were the last time you were here. Not our topic. Anyway, so when Olam Haba, let's get back on topic, is when the world gets back to the way it was before the mistakes that we started to make going all the way back to Adam. If you've heard of concepts, resurrection of the dead and final judgment, that takes place then in that 7th millennium. But we're not going to talk about that right now. That's not our topic. Okay, so now we understand. So the question is, where are we in our story? So what year are we in? 5,780. So if every millennia is 1,000 years, what day of the week are we in? Every day of the week is 1,000 years. When you get to 5,000, you're in Friday. 5,500 is halfway through the hours of the day. 5,750, 3/4 of the way through the day. 5,780, we are late Friday afternoon. Sorry, I skipped the quote. Here's my mom. He's talking about the Messiah. We are late Friday afternoon. This is the time in an observant home when the wife is generally, yelling at the husband, get in the shower. It's going to be Shabbos, 20 minutes. And we know, by the way, anyone, Murphy's Law, you guys know Murphy's Law? Like the chance of the bread falling butter side down is directly proportional to the price of the carpet. And these important laws about reality. What's the Murphy's Law of Shabbat? No matter when you start preparing for Shabbat, even if for you guys in the Southern Hemisphere, it's like in December on Sunday morning when Shabbat's coming really late, you start making your cholent and your kishka. You're still running around like a chicken with your head cut off 6 days later at sunset. Just as everything speeds up and gets intense as you hit the hard deadline of Shabbat, everything speeds up and gets really intense as you approach the hard deadline of Messiah, which Jewish tradition says he has to come and complete the job by the year 6,000. Complete the job. Someone always asks me, what if the Messiah doesn't come by the year 6,000? I always say, what do you want from me? Ask for your money back. It hasn't happened yet. It's in the future. But do the math. What's 5,000? What's 6,000 minus 5,780? That's 220 years left, and that's a maximum. And just as we don't bring in Shabbat at sunset, I don't know, in South Africa, I'm sure it's 18 minutes early, the Messiah can and will come before that deadline. Again, exact date I don't know, but as we go on now and look at the convergence of current events and biblical prophecy, boy, are we going to see that we are getting really, really close. Okay, so let's now begin by looking at prophecy And again, before we look at the future, we have to understand what prophecy is, and we have to understand prophecy's track record. Let's go to Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, one of the great Jewish minds of modern Jewish history of the last, he's from the 18th century. In his book, Derech Hashem, The Way of God, he says, the main concept of true prophecy is therefore the living person achieves such an attachment and bond with God. This in and of itself is certainly a very high degree of perfection. Besides this, however, it is often accompanied by certain information and enlightenment. Through prophecy, one can gain knowledge of many lofty truths among God's hidden mysteries. These things are perceived very clearly. Part of a prophet's career may include being sent on a mission by God. By the way, the Talmud tells us there were hundreds of thousands of people who attained prophecy. Unfortunately, the door to prophecy has been locked since the beginning of the Second Temple, but before that time, for hundreds of years. Of that, only 48 men and 7 women are known by name, because their message, which is they're the authors of what we call the different books in the Bible, most of them, different people. You know, Moses is the highest level prophecy, but they get recorded because their message, and anything in the Hebrew Bible is there because it meets 2 criteria. One, written by a prophet of various levels, but they're all prophets who've worked on themselves till they've gained this perfection and break through the veneer of what we perceive to be reality, which is what we live in, ladies and gentlemen, and enter this higher level of cognizance. And depending upon the amount of work they do, they can get to a higher level. And in the case of Moses, he, so to speak, hears God speak. Okay, but to be in the Bible, it has to be written by a prophet and have a message that is relevant to us until today, which means every word of the Bible, when you're reading it, you have to be asking, why is this in here? What am I supposed to learn from this? But prophecy, if you read it, is subdivided because most prophets will give 2 kinds of messages, double-edged sword. What are the 2 kinds of prophecies? There's positive and there's negative. And what's the difference between positive and negative prophecy? Besides one makes you smile and the other you need Prozac to deal with. This is very important as we look at the class now. Positive is guaranteed. That's always talked about. Whatever good is guaranteed has to happen at some point eventually. Negative is a warning. It can be avoided. Like your mother says to you when you're little, you know, eat your Brussels sprouts or your green string beans or you're not going to get dessert. So we understand that point? So now that we understand that, now we can start looking at prophecy itself. But this is pretty heavy stuff. This is otherworldly. It's supernatural. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I wasn't actually raised religious. I'm what's called FFA. You guys know the term, you know, BT, Baal Tshuva. I know a lot of South African Jews are Baal Tshuva, and almost all of you are Lithuanians. And there's also FFB, from birth, born religious. I'm FFA. I'm from Aish. I came for 3 months and I never left, and I'm here 38 years later. Baruch Hashem, thank God. But I was like skeptical about all this stuff. I mean, I don't want to keep Shabbat or kosher. I wanted to know, like, show me some evidence that this stuff is for real and legit. So same thing now. Before we look at the future, and a lot of us have, you know, we have simple faith. We're just going to believe what's written there. But what's the track record? One of the advantages to being where we are in Jewish history, which is really close to the end of the story, 5007 AD, is that most of the story is behind us. So we can compare what was predicted at the beginning, going back 3,331 years ago, which is what it was last Mount Sinai, when we got the first prophecies from Moses when he's writing the book down, you know, after we leave Egypt. Till today, we have thousands of years of Jewish history to look at and human history to look at. And we can compare what's predicted versus what's happens. And that way, we can decide, I'm going to use it, I'm sorry, I don't know, I should use a cricket analogy or something for South Africans. I don't know cricket. Cricket to me is a guy who runs back and forth for a couple of days and everyone else drinks beer. But I'll use a baseball analogy, you know, the batting average. We can look at the batting average of prophecy. What's predicted versus what's happened. You know, if you hit every single ball, you're batting 1,000, we say. Is prophecy batting 1,000 or not? So what we're going to do is I want to run through some of the major prophetic themes and see, have they happened? And then we're going to do a switch over to the ones that are either happening or haven't happened yet. And based on what's happened or predicted already versus what happened, if it's matching parallel, then we can be confident that what hasn't happened, right, is likely to happen. And we're going to see exactly that. Jewish history, by the way, is comprised of a series of trends and events. Each and every one of them is either unusual or unique, meaning happened to maybe a few people or only happened to us. And they combine together to make a history unlike anyone else's. I'm going to do a short version of one of my favorite classes to teach from the world famous Esha Torah Discovery Seminar called The 7 Wonders of Jewish History, a very brief version of it. But it's a great chizuk amun, it's a great strengthening of faith and the power of prophecy and God's control of history. So let's run through some of these now and we'll see. Sorry, occasionally I forget to put things up on the screen. There we have positive guaranteed, negative conditional can be avoided. Okay, so one of the earliest predictions in the very beginning of our history that God promises to Abraham is that there'll always be a Jewish people, which makes sense because if our role in history, because of the responsibility that Abraham chooses, is so critical, then we have to be around. The main actor, the star of the movie, can't disappear mid-movie. Just can't happen. Too much is depending on him. And this is repeated over and over again. We're not going to read all the prophecies. We'd be here for hours and hours. But here's a classic one from the very beginning of Genesis. God says he will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations, an eternal covenant to be the God and the God of your descendants after you. So God says to Abraham, between you and I, there's going to be an eternal relationship. You're not going to last forever, but no matter what, there'll always be a Jewish people. Let's go back up for a second. Hold on a second. And this is repeated over and over again. Now, by the way, we may not appreciate that we're even a nation. We are a nation. We're not just a religion, like being Christian. We have a land, a language, and a history. But not only are we a nation, one of the oldest nations on the planet Earth. We may not appreciate it, but a lot of famous non-Jews do. For instance, Mark Twain, famous American author, whose real name is Samuel Clemens. He says it beautifully. He says, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Persian rose filled the world with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they're gone. The Jews saw them all, beat them all. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? So God promises we're going to outlast, we're going to be that eternal nation. Famous Russian author Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, which if you can see his face over there, he looks like a big rabbi to me. He's just missing the black hat. But famous Russian author Tolstoy, author of War and Peace and other works of light Russian literature, he says, let us see what kind of peculiar creature the Jew is, which all the rulers and all the nations have together and separately abused and molested, oppressed and persecuted, trampled and butchered, burned and hanged, and in spite of all this is yet alive. The Jew is the emblem of eternity. Such a nation cannot be destroyed. The Jew is as everlasting as is eternity itself. So you see people like Twain and Tolstoy and so many other historians exactly confirming exactly what God promises to the Jewish people, despite, by the way, their circumstances in our history, which by all normal laws of history, as we'll see, would guarantee not our survival, but our extinction. And as a matter of fact, if you look in the Bible or in the history books of ancient history, there's so many civilizations and empires. And if you want to meet them today, you got to go to an archaeological site, a history book, or a museum. Like Mark Twain said, we saw them all, we beat them all. We took a licking, but we kept on ticking. So far, so good. For 3,800 years since Abraham's time, Jewish people is still around. By the way, what would you expect to see? What gives a nation its strongest sense of national identity and connection? The clear answer is its connection to its land. Okay, homeland. So being in your homeland. So a logical prediction or pattern would be eternal nation, eternally on their national homeland. Yet what's predicted, number 2, huge pattern in Jewish history is exile and dispersion. And without even looking at Jewish history, ladies and gentlemen, just think logically. Take a nation, throw them out of their homeland, and scatter them. What's going to happen? Within a few generations, a few here, a few there, they're going to assimilate. So exile is extremely rare in human history. Multiple exiles, meaning to be thrown out of your land more than once, come back, and then be thrown out and dispersed, is unique to the Jewish people. It should have caused our extinction. It's unique itself, yet it's exactly what's predicted in Jewish history, like you see in Leviticus 26:33. And you all will scatter amongst the nations at the point of my drawn sword, leaving your country desolate and your cities in ruins. Nice cheerful prophecy. Or how about this one? You'll be torn from the land you are about to acquire, and God shall scatter you among all the peoples from one end of the earth to the other. And that's what's predicted. And what exactly happens in Jewish history? First, we're going to have 10 tribes. A good chunk of Jewish history follows that normal pattern 2,700 years ago, when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and exiled the 10 tribes and become the 10 lost tribes. Many of the refugees will flee south to the southern kingdom of Judah. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you got to get my book, Crash Course in Jewish History, because we have such an incredible history and so few of us know it. And then fast forward 130 years later, the Babylonians 9th of Av, Tisha B'av, destroy Jerusalem, burn the temple, and send us to Babylon for 70 years. We come back after 70 years. We have a second temple period of 420 years. We're persecuted first by the Greeks in Hanukkah, then by the Romans. The year 70, they will destroy the temple. In 135, we have the Bar Kokhba uprising. We're driven out of our land and we spread to the four corners of the earth. And until today, we have Jews scattered everywhere. It's the Jewish diaspora, it's such a unique phenomenon. And we have been in many places longer than the people who live there today in those nations, including most of the Arabs in the Middle East, you should know. Yet we are still here despite being scattered from one end of the earth to the other. Okay, so what else we have in our predicted in our book by our prophet, by Moses? So since we are an ancient people who've been around for a very long time, and by the way, you should know that the first in Genesis story is only one of the 613 commandments, which is to be fruitful and multiply, which is actually a commandment, which is why until today, observant Jews have still very high birth rates. A logical prediction would be there should be a lot of Jews, yet what's predicted, number 3, we're going to be few in number, which makes no sense at all. A few Jews scattered here and there is a guaranteed recipe for extinction, yet it's exactly what's predicted if we look in Deuteronomy, and you shall remain few in number amongst the nations where God will lead you. And it goes, and this is predicted multiple times. If we compare how weird is Jewish demography, because everything in our history is weird or unusual and violates all the laws of human history, even the negative stuff. Compare the demographics of Jews to, let's say, our good friends, the Chinese, who happen to be around for a very long time and happen to have done a census, one of the first people to do a census 2,200 years ago in the Han Dynasty. There were 30 million Chinese in the world. Today, there are 1.4 billion. And they had wars and plagues and famines and invasions, but they are now one out of every 5 of us should be speaking Mandarin statistically. Jews going back 2,000 years ago, estimated 6 to 8 million Jews in the world, all religious, marrying young, having as many kids as humanly possible. Demographers estimate there should be between 250 million and 750 million Jews. Yet what do we got? 14 million. That's crazy. Instead of being the 3rd largest ethnic group in the world after China and India, we are 0.2% of the world's population. The fact that any of us are here makes absolutely no sense. It's a complete supernatural phenomenon. What else can we throw in to make Jewish survival completely impossible? How about anti-Semitism? I said even the negative stuff is unique. And there's nothing quite like anti-Semitism in the horrible world of hatred and intolerance. There's a lot of it going around this world, but like everything else, hatred of us is unique. In the book of Leviticus, it talks about, and those of you who survive in the land of your enemies, I shall make so faint-hearted that if leaves rustle behind them, they will flee headlong as if from the sword, though no one pursues them, stumbling over one another as if to escape a weapon while no one is after them. So helpless will you be to take a stand against your foes. You shall perish amongst the nations, and the land of your enemies shall consume you. Pretty scary stuff. Or if you look at Deuteronomy 28, among those nations you shall find no respite, no rest for your foot. Their God will make you cowardly, destroying your outlook and making life hopeless. You will live in constant suspense day and night. You'll be terrified, never sure of your existence. Thankfully, probably most of us haven't lived through anything like this. But if you study Jewish history, you don't have to go back too far to see what's being described here, as bleak as it is. It's not just in the book of Lamentations we just read, which is a pretty horrible description, but this is what's hounded us throughout history. Of persecutions and expulsions all the way up through the Holocaust. This is the norm. And everything about anti-Semitism is unique and in a category by itself. Beginning with what Dr. Bernard Lewis, Professor Emeritus of Near Eastern Studies, who just passed away last year at 102 years old, writes, hatred of Jews has many parallels and yet is unique in its persistence and its extent, its potency and its virulence, its terrible final solution. Conventional prejudice and persecution can be very terrible, but they differ from anti-Semitism as that's conventional from nuclear war. The world is full of racist, bigots, and intolerant people, but Jew hatred is in a category all by itself. It's unique category. And what sets it apart are these 4 things: universality, longevity, intensity, irrationality. Number 1, universality is that unlike other hatreds, hatred of us has not been limited to our relationship with one country, one race, one religion, one people. Wherever we have gone in significant numbers, it is followed as the most universal hatred in the world. Number 2 is longevity. It's the longest hatred on the planet Earth. It goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. Number 3 is the intensity. The dictionary definition of anti-Semitism might be prejudice or hostility towards Jews, but it's a lot worse than just prejudice and some hostility. It's one unendingly long list of persecution, expulsion, humiliation, ghettoization, rape, pillage, beating, all the way up to, what's the worst thing you can do to anyone you hate? What's killing a whole nation? What's the word? Genocide. And that word was invented by a Polish Jewish refugee in 1944, Dr. Raphael Lemkin, who's the father of the concept of crimes against humanity and international law. Fleeing from Poland to England during the Holocaust, he says there's a crime happening in Europe there's no word to describe, and he creates this word, genocide. By the way, the word anti-Semitism itself, it's the only form of racial or religious intolerance that has its own word to describe it. Think about it. You hate a black person, what are you? A racist. You hate an Asian, you're a racist. Only Jew hate has its own word to describe it. Whoa. And last but not least, that sets it apart is the irrationality. We have been accused of everything. We kidnap Christian babies, use their blood to bake matzah. We poison wells. We're in league with the devil. We control the world's economy, seismic activities, solar flares. We trigger tsunamis in Southeast Asia to drown Indonesia with tidal waves, release sharks into the Red Sea to destroy Egyptian tourism. We send vultures to spy on Saudi Arabia and wild pigs to destroy Palestinian crops. Last year, Iran accused Israel of stealing its clouds. Some of these things were said 1,000 years ago. Some of these things were said last year. None of them have anything to do with reality. Professor Michael Curtis of Rutgers University said it the best. Anything and everything is a reason to hate the Jew. Whatever you hate, the Jew is that. We're not going to get to the real reason. You're welcome to go to my website. You'll see it at the end of the presentation and go watch the Why the Jews presentation. I think it's a great thing to do on Tisha B'av, by the way, to understand what really from the Jewish perspective drives anti-Semitism. But you put it all together and you have a hatred unlike any other hatred. You combine it with exile and dispersion and few in number, and you got, like we say in American baseball, 3 strikes and you're out. To be exiled, dispersed, scattered around the world, few in number, and hated by everyone, everywhere, longer than anyone else. There's no way we should survive. Yet they're all predicted prophetically. They've all happened. And point number 1, guys, we're still here. Even when all the people who tried to kill us are gone. What would you expect to see from people who went through this history? I would say nothing. But in contradiction to any logic, the author's going to put in, boom, light to nations. This is the topic, by the way, that I speak on more than any other topic. The first book I wrote, it's called World Perfect. You'll also see at the end of the presentation a little image of it. It's all on this topic. It's a fantastic understanding to understand what we brought to the world. But in the context of this presentation, it makes no sense. What does it mean, light to nations? In Genesis 22, God says to Abraham, all the nations of the world shall be blessed through your descendants because you, Abraham, have hearkened to my voice. And Isaiah goes on to say, for behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and a thick darkness the nations, but God will shine upon you. Nations shall then go by your light, and kings by your radiant illumination. Nations and kings are going to follow the Jewish people. Isn't that beautiful? Ladies and gentlemen, time out, time out, time out. Are we in the same universe here? I mean, think about it psychologically. You want to be like people you like or people you dislike? Obviously, people you like. Little Jewish kids don't come home and say, Mommy, Daddy, I want to be like Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler when I grow up. In the image of the non-Jew collectively, what is the image of the Jew throughout history? In the mind of the non-Jew, what's the image of us? Overwhelmingly negative. Okay, but there have been people who have been very, not nice, but have been very impactful. I'll give you a couple of examples, Greeks and Romans. Today we talk about ancient Greece and ancient Rome, so amazing. Trust me, when you heard that Caesar or Alexander the Great was coming to your country thousands of years ago, you were not excited. How were these people so impactful? They conquered and they stuffed their values and their taxes and everything down your throat. But that's not us. We don't have any empire. The only Jewish empire in history has been Hollywood. Complete creation of Jews and not a source of Jewish values. So given that everyone hates us and we're in no position to be pushing our values and our ideology on anyone, yet arguably we, the teeny tiny Jewish people, have had the biggest impact on humanity's conscience. And besides all the things we know about, like guilt bagels, junk bonds, leverage buyouts, Einstein, Marx, Freud, 22% of all the Nobel Prizes since 1901, what is the light we've been to nations? What's the greatest impact we've had? And the answer is one God and one absolute standard of morality. What I talked about at the beginning. We may not appreciate this, but a lot of famous non-Jews do, like the second president of the United States, John Adams. I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. And if you were running for president today, I would definitely be voting for him. Or how about famous historian Paul Johnson, British historian? He says, certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. And he goes on to list, you can read the whole quote, all the different values that we gave the world. All these come from one God, one absolute standard of morality. He says it's almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared if they had never emerged. And in the course of writing my first book, World Perfect, I came across dozens of presidents, prime ministers, philosophers, historians, thinkers. They all say the same thing. We, the teeny tiny Jewish people who by all the laws of human history shouldn't even be here, we have not only survived, we've transformed the world. What else can we throw in before we move to the future? I know, we're winging through this fast, but it's so important to establish the credibility of prophecy so that we know whether to take the stuff that hasn't happened yet is predicted seriously. Last but not least, there's more, by the way, but we're just not going to go into them now. I think I made the case. Return to the land of Israel. This is a singular event in human history. No nation ever lost its homeland multiple times, was scattered around the world, hated by everyone, everywhere, longer than anyone else, and came back. And in the, in this dusty, in the ashes of the Holocaust, in this dusty wasteland on the Eastern Mediterranean, reestablished its state. It's complete, which by the way bloomed, and is this little superpower in the world. Yet it's predicted everywhere in the Torah. Deuteronomy, this is one of the most oft repeated ideas in Judaism. He shall return you and gather among all the nations, and the Lord your God will bring you into the land your fathers inherited. You will acquire, and he will make you even more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. And in fact, we saw it. In May 1948, the state of Israel was reborn. And today, whereas in 1900, 0.5%, I'll get to that in a minute, so I'm not going to say that quite yet, but the state of Israel was created. So guys, there's more to do, but that's enough to make my case. We just spent about 20 minutes doing that, or 15 minutes doing that. How are we doing so far? None of this history makes any sense. Oh, I forgot to lay out my analogy. I'm apologizing. I have to. When I lay out the analogy before I present this, I always give an example of, imagine you guys are billionaires and you like investing your money. And I show up and I have a hedge fund. I want you to give me, the minimum buy-in is $25 million. That's a lot of rand. Now you can easily afford that because you got a lot of money. But before you write out the check, what are you going to want to see? Track record. Like, do you have other funds? How successful have your funds been? How have you performed? So imagine now I've just laid out for you, my track record. And now I'm asking you, please write out that check for $25 million to buy into my fund. Okay. Now you're probably going to say to me, I don't know how you're doing this because you have a very unconventional investment style. But so far, everything you say has actually happened. So you're going to write the check out? I think you will. You probably can't figure out what I'm doing that's enabling to be so successful. So too, guys, we see that everything predicted, even though it's unique or unusual, doesn't fit together, violates all the laws of human history, and makes us a living phenomenon. I mean, Thomas Newton, the Bishop of Bristol in England, and then in the 18th century, has a great quote. He said, the preservation of the Jew is the single greatest act of God's providence. Did you want to see God's hand in history? Just look at the Jewish people, which is what, by the way, Blaise Pascal, the famous French mathematician philosopher, says to Louis XIV in the 17th century, when Louis XIV asks him for proof of the supernatural. So now when we switch to the prophecies that remain to take place, we have to, it would be stupid for us to ignore them because we've seen that so far everything that has been predicted has happened so far. So before we do that, just very quickly, I want to show you one more quote from Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman. Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman was one of the great leaders of European Jewry pre-Holocaust. Unfortunately, he himself did not even live to see the end of the Holocaust or the rebirth of Israel because he himself was murdered in the Holocaust. But look what he says. If we wish to comprehend the nature of events in our lives, we must seek out those verses and teachings of the rabbis which relate to the period preceding the Messiah. That's the period we're in now. That is the transitional period between the end of exile and the redemption. If we compare what is written to the events taking place, we will see a mirror image of everything that is happening to us. Everything mentioned in the Torah becomes concrete fact, and conversely, nothing is happening that was not predicted by the Torah in advance. Pretty unbelievable. So what we're going to do now is look at some of the prophecies that remain to be fulfilled. And how close are we? And trust me, Amir, it's going to take us another few minutes, but it's not that long. You will be in a much better position, especially on this very heavy day of Tisha B'av. This is a huge wake-up call for that. We need to take this seriously because big things are happening. Okay, so we're told that as we approach the end of days, tshuva, spiritual return. As it says in Deuteronomy, and it shall come to pass when all these things have come upon you. I love this quote, especially in the context of what we just saw and all the predictions that were predicted and happened. The blessings and the curses, you shall return to the Lord your God and obey his voice according to all that I have commanded you today, you and your children with all your heart and with all your soul. And Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish scholar who died in 1204, was born in Cordoba in Spain and died in Fulstadt, which is Cairo of today. He writes, all the prophets charge the people concerning tshuva. Only through tshuva will Israel be redeemed, and the Torah already offered the assurance that Israel will, in the closing period of its exile, finally do tshuva and therefore be immediately redeemed. Keep this quote in the back of your mind because you notice tshuva is the key and it's a good prophecy. Remember, it's got to happen. Okay. Physical return. Now we see the state of Israel is reborn in 1948, but only 600,000 Jews, about 5% of the Jews in the world are living in Israel around the time of the War of Independence. Yet we're told that, and that was a pretty tough time to be in Israel, as we approach the end of days, in Deuteronomy it says, he shall return and gather you from among all the nations. If your outcasts be at the utmost parts of heaven, that includes Joburg. That's as far away from that's as far south as you can get from here, pretty much. From there, he will gather you, and the Lord your God will bring you into the land your fathers inherited. You will acquire, and he will make you even more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. There'll be more Jews and more wealth in Israel at the end than there was going back to the grand days of the First Temple period, we're told. And that exile, that diaspora is going to shut down, and all the Jews will return. Okay, what else? Now it gets a little scary. Gog and Magog. This is talked about in Ezekiel and Zechariah. Now, you have to remember, these are prophets who are getting images of things and translating those images into words to describe what they see. Now, Gog and Magog, just to give you an overview quickly, is a end-of-day struggle when the nations of the world come together to try and stop the Jewish people returning physically and spiritually in the land of Israel. And remember, back then, Ezekiel and Zechariah living 2,500 or so years ago, they're going to talk about horses and chariots when they talk about armies. They're not going to talk about cruise missiles, Apache attack helicopters, and Abrams tanks. So when you read these quotes, you can't take them literally in terms of the technology, but you have to understand the spirit and the theme that are being talked about here. Look at this quote here from Ezekiel. Thus says the Lord God, behold, I'm against you, Gog, prince and leader of Meshech and Tuval. We're not sure who this is. There's all kinds of speculation. In the end of years, you will come to the land restored from the sword, gathered from many nations upon the mountains of Israel that have laid desolate continuously. Oh my God, this is exactly what's happened in our history in the last 50, 60 years. To a people who have been brought from the nations, all of them dwelling in security. You will attack like a storm, you will come. You will be like a cloud covering the earth. You and your cohorts and many nations with you. Thus says the Lord God, surely on that day when my people Israel dwells securely, you will come to know when you come from your place at the uttermost parts of the north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding horses, a vast horde, a mighty army. And you advance against my people Israel like a cloud covering the earth. It will be at the end of days that I will bring you upon my land in order that the nations may know me. So God will bring the nations against the world, those that choose to come after us, to judge them and to punish them accordingly. But this is very heavy stuff, this Gog and Magog stuff. And again, it's important to take out the theme, not so much the literal, the chariots, etc. Look at what Zechariah says, who writes at the very beginning of the Second Temple period, the prophecy of the word of Hashem concerning Israel. Behold, I am making Jerusalem a cup of poison for all the peoples all around. Also, Judah will be caught up in the siege of Jerusalem. It shall be at the end of days that I will make Jerusalem for all the peoples a burdensome stone, all whose bearers become lacerated, and all the nations of the world will gather against it. So the world will largely unite to come against the Jewish people, and the focus will be, of course, the issue of Jerusalem, sovereignty in Jerusalem. The Zohar, the basic book of Jewish mysticism, which Jewish tradition says was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai over about 1800 years ago, when hiding in a cave from the Romans, he writes, the children of Yishmael, who's that, guys? The Arabs. And they agree with that, by the way. The children of Ishmael will go up at the time of the nations of the world against Jerusalem. So they're right up in the forefront. The nations unite, focus is Jerusalem. They're trying to stop us, this whole incredible process of the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. So summary of the prophecies, Jewish people return to Israel. The world unites against Israel. Jerusalem is at the center of the conflict. So what else do we have now to look at? Ooh, now here's what's going to get really interesting. Okay. Weapons of mass destruction. Now this is not, the term doesn't, WMD doesn't appear in the Torah, but look at these descriptions and tell me what it reminds you of. Again, keeping in mind that people didn't know about this, the modern technology of warfare going back thousands of years. Zechariah, this is scary stuff. I get goosebumps when I read this. And there shall be a day that is known to God, which shall be neither day nor night. But it shall come to pass that in the evening there shall be a light. And this shall be the plague which the Lord will strike all the nations that have gathered against Jerusalem. Their flesh will be consumed while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will be consumed in their sockets, and their tongues will be consumed in their mouths. Whoa, gives me the creeps reading this every time. Now, by the way, if you want to go read John Hershey's book, Hiroshima, if you want to get the closest description to what we're talking about here. But that seems to be what it's talking about. Look what the prophet Joel says. Joel, I will show my wonders in heaven and on earth, blood and fire and timrot ashan. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood at the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Whew, creepy stuff. I deliberately didn't translate timrot ashan. Here's how it appears in Hebrew. Hebrew is a trilateral root language, meaning there's three letters that give you the essence of the word. Timrot comes from the root tamal, taf mem resh, which is a date palm. So it's date palms, ashan, which means smoke. Okay. That's a date palm in the Middle East. That's what we got. What's a date palm of smoke? We don't have mushrooms in the Middle East, not damp enough. Could be. Creepy stuff. What else? Hevle HaMashiach, the birth pangs of the Messiah. Now, I know men should never talk about women giving birth. I apologize. I've had a kidney stone a few times. I've been told that's the closest thing guys can get to experiencing that. But, so pardon me, ladies. But this idea that a woman goes through contractions, as we'll see in a minute, it's paralleled by history. And again, here is Rabbi Isra Meir Kagan, the Chafetz Chaim in Shem Olam, describing the entire period of diaspora is like a pregnancy, and the end of the exile will be like the pangs of childbirth. This is what the Talmud in Shabbat called Hevle HaMashiach, the birth pangs of the Messiah. As our sages said, if you see suffering increasing and threatening to drown you like a river, expect him, meaning the Messiah is on the way. This is the reason why troubles subside from time to time, because in childbirth, the labor contractions temporarily subside to give the mother brief respite. But if women in labor did not have these short intervals of relief, they might die in childbirth, heaven forbid. But after an interval of respite, the contractions resume. It is just so in our times. So what you happen, and again, when a woman's giving birth, I've seen, I have 5 kids. I've been in the room watching. The contractions come closer and closer and get more and more intense. So too, ladies and gentlemen, we are told that as we get to the end of days, things will speed up and get more and more intense. Now, let's just go back. 1900, which is always the time of, let's say, your great-grandparents. My father's father was born in 1895. How likely would all this scenario, Jews return and nations unite? 1900, how likely would this have seemed? So what was the world like in 1900? First of all, it was the longest sustained period of peace, prosperity, growth, and optimism in the history of Europe. Was the end of the 19th, early 20th century. Nationalism was the overwhelming force. There was no idea, there was no world coalitions, there was no League of Nations and World Bank and any of that stuff. There was no mass communication. This was BC, before cell phones. There was no weapons of mass destruction. There was no Arab states. The Middle East was basically, first the Ottomans were occupying. It was just, there was no countries like that. There was the creation of the British and the French later in history. But not only that, the Jewish world in 1900, Jews returned to Israel, returned to Judaism. In 1900, this comes after the Napoleonic Wars, early 19th century, all of Western European Jewry is emancipated. Okay, you have emancipation, which leads to mass assimilation of Jews in Western Europe, and also all those Jews fleeing to America, 2.5 million. A few end up in South Africa from the Russian Empire, from Lithuania mostly, but most end up in America where they all massive assimilation. Anti-Semitism was totally on a decline because Jews were assimilating, and Western liberal society was seemingly this: you don't have anti-Semitism and racism anymore. It's not cool. If you'd asked a sociologist in 1900 what's going to be with anti-Semitism in the year 2000, he said there's not going to be any anti-Semitism because there's not going to be any Jews by then. There was no state of Israel. There was a little backwater province of the rotting Ottoman Turkish Empire. 99% of the Jews are living in diaspora. Palestine was this insignificant province on the fringes of the Ottoman Empire. And Jerusalem was undeveloped and politically insignificant. Guys, all of this would have seemed even 100 or so years ago like completely ridiculous. Speaking about rapidity of change, problem is when it happens so fast, we don't have the perspective. But look what's happened in the last about 100 years. We have world unity, the UN, the EU, the Gulf War Coalition. The whole world went to war against one country then. We have a global community, internet, air travel, globalization. Israel's reborn, and now 48% of the Jews. By the way, the world's population has gone up since the end of the Holocaust, about 340%. The population of Israel has gone up over 1,100%, more than 3 times what the world has done. There are more Jews living in Israel today than any time in human history. And within a few years, given the instability, with more aliyah for the first time in 2,500 years, because in the Second Temple, the majority of Jews lived in diaspora, the majority of Jews will be back in the land of Israel. And in my mind, that's going to be, boom, the tipping point. The Baal Tshuva movement, a lot of you guys are experiencing that. I am too. No such thing. My rabbi, Reb Noach Weinberg, is one of the real founders of the whole movement. In the 1950s, no one even thought it could be done. Yet look at, there's so many Baal Tshuva. An explosion of anti-Semitism. We had the Holocaust from the most enlightened country in Europe, and now anti-Semitism is at levels we haven't seen since the Holocaust. Led by the world, led by the Arabs, the world is united against Israel. The U.S. is basically the one blocking force against the nations that would physically attack Israel and the nations that would stand behind those nations and back them to attack us. Jerusalem is at the center of the conflict. That last intifada in 2000, remember, it was called the El-Aqsa Intifada. We have weapons of mass destruction. The greatest threat to Israel is Iran going nuclear. And Hevle HaMashiach, everything is moving so fast. It's absolutely unbelievable. Like, we can't keep track of this stuff. What is going on? Guys, think about it. You know, what seemed impossible only 100 years ago is not only possible, but it's probable. Prophecies literally unfolding before our eyes and in the front page of the newspaper as we watch online. So how does this make us feel? Like, where do we fit in? Now, I'm not doing this to freak people out. It's to wake us up. You know, I once taught this class years ago, and a guy said, Rabbi, I believe you. It's coming to an end. I'm going to get an end of days bomb shelter in Montana. I said, that's not why I taught the class. You could run and hide. It's the idea of waking us up to take it seriously. Guys, we have to appreciate it. Doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. If it's reality, it's reality. And prophecy seems to show everything predicted is coming true. And even the prophecies that remain to be predicted, you look at them. They're most of the way there already. We are so crazy close. You don't believe it, fine, but it's like gravity. What? I believe in gravity, you don't. We go to the top of a building and jump off. What? I fall and you float? But the point is to wake up and recognize, whoa, this is unbelievable wake-up call to us, but we have to ask ourselves a question. Where do we fit in? What can I do here? You know, remember, first of all, time is running out, okay? But we have to, first of all, remember, go back. Before we freak out, we have to remember, number one, that we have a unique role to play in the story. We say every morning before we start the formal prayers, Ashreinu Matov Halkenu. Happy are we, how good is our lot. We have to recognize that it might not always be comfortable to be Jewish because we have a unique responsibility, but we, the Jewish people, individually and collectively, have the ability, despite our teeny size, to impact the world in ways that no other people can do. We have a tremendous responsibility on our shoulders. What does that mean for each and every one of us individually? Like, how does that work out? We talk about a God who knows and controls everything, but do we really have free will? Who am I? I'm one little person. Maybe I think I'm choosing, like in a movie, the actors might seem to be like making decisions and having emotions, but they're just faking it. They're reading your lines and they got into their part. So I just want to end with an analogy and just stick with me for a couple of more minutes because this is what we need to take with us. How does it work? Are we choosing? Do we really have free will? So let me end with this analogy now, and I think it'll be clear. So imagine this scenario. Now, this is for Americans. I designed this, but I don't know if in South Africa you have this in Kruger National Park. But in American national parks, they have fire towers where forest rangers can look for forest fires. But imagine you climb up to the top of this fire tower and you're looking through a very powerful telescope and you see in the distance, like 60 miles away, the most beautiful scenery, this gorgeous mountain with this lake in front of it. And you look even closer at super high magnification, you see there's this Easy Boy lounge chair. You see it over there? And there's Smithers, the butler, standing there with this pina colada drink, waiting for you. Now, as a host to the scenario, and he tells you, he says, here's the deal. You got 6 days, but between you and the mountain is this really deep Amazonian tropical rainforest thing. You can't see more than a few feet into it. He says, here's the deal. You got 6 days to make it through the 60 miles of forest, climb up to the top of the mountain, sit in the lounge chair, drink the pina colada, enjoy the view. He said there's multiple paths. Some are easy, some are hard. You can get off the hard and get onto the easy. You can get off the easy and go into the hard. He says another thing. Now, if anyone ever seen the movie The Hunger Games, it's the great analogy for this. He says everything here looks normal and natural, but it's really an incredible simulation. We control everything, okay? But for you, everything's going to seem real. The animals, the nature, the weather, the humidity, you name it. You got to eat, you got to drink, but I can hit the escape button and I guarantee you make it. But you decide the path you take. So you climb down to the bottom and you see all these paths disappearing to the forest, and you can't see more than 100 meters into the forest. And you got your backpack and your walking stick and your hat, and the gun goes off. And you can go down one path, which is actually pretty straightforward, where you walk into the forest and you come into a clearing. There's a golf cart there. Whoa, that's pretty convenient, the driver. And then he drives you to this big open field, and you sit there for a few minutes, and what comes along? A helicopter. And you get in the helicopter, and you take a short flight because 60 miles by helicopter is nothing. And sure enough, you're at the top of the mountain. An hour and a half later, quick and painless. That's one extreme. Or another extreme. You go down another path, and there's Smithers, sorry, the butler. Another path, and boom, you bump into these guys. Very scary. And they're shooting poison dart frog darts at you. And you're crossing these fraying rope bridges with crocodiles underneath, and it's 110% humidity and 100 degrees outside, and mosquitoes and leeches are sucking all the blood out of your body, and lions and leopards are chasing you through the jungle. And in that scenario, it's 5 minutes to midnight at the end of the last day. Your supplies are up. Time is almost up. You're missing a few minor body parts. Your clothes are shredded, and you have to be medevaced up the top of the mountain in a medevac helicopter and drink that pina colada through an IV tube. But what's the point? You made it. But how quickly, how slowly, how painlessly, how painfully, that was up to us. This is exactly the point, ladies and gentlemen. We've gone through so much history, 5,780 years. What's in the past is in the past. We should learn from it, but not dwell on it. Okay, we can't change that. Unlike in this scenario where it's one guy going in 6 days, we're talking about generations of Jews traveling through 6,000 years. And in a relay race, you pass the baton on, the previous generation, to us, and we can decide to speed it up or we can slow it down and go in the wrong way. Individually and collectively, decisions we make. The Rambam, Maimonides says, we should look at tshuva as the scales are perfectly balanced, and you add a little bit to one scale and it's going to tip, and then you change the course. The decisions we make, we are really choosing. God knows what we're going to choose, but we are really choosing. So how do you know which path to take, by the way? That's the really important thing to focus on here. The stupid way to do this would be to go, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, down which path do I go? The smart way would be to read the map. But the one option we do not have, guys, is to sit there and do nothing. Because imagine you're sitting at the bottom of the mountain and time is almost up and you're exhausted and your clothes are shredded and you can't move and you go, that's it. I hear the helicopter coming. Bung, 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 bung. I remember the guy told me, he promised we would make it. I'll just sit here and wait. Because as we're sitting there and waiting, this is what comes out of the forest. Guys, like I said, I'm not a prophet, but I'll make one prediction. Either we, the Jewish people, and we should really focus on this on Tisha B'av, either we will get our act together, have some unity and proactivity, and push forward with our national historic mission of living and acting the way we're supposed to do, or, and we're promised this, we will be put in more difficult and dangerous situations, individually and collectively, where even the most non-religious Jew is going to be saying, God, please help me. But guys, the purpose is not, we don't want to panic, okay? That's not what we want to do here. We have to recognize, like I said, that being Jewish is not always comfortable. It might not be comfortable, but it's always meaningful. We have a unique responsibility in the world. Our ability to actualize our greatness comes from living up to that responsibility and recognizing that I said that we are lucky to be this unique people with this unique responsibility. But how do you know which path to take? We're pretty much at the end. Think about it. The finish line is in front of us. Like we always say, you got to read the map. And in our case, what's the map? The map is not our phone program that we like to read today to navigate. It's the Torah. The literal definition of Torah is Torah Chaim. It's the guidebook for living. Okay, it's how we're supposed to live. Again, God doesn't need us to do anything. But you can't represent the Jewish people until you know what the Jewish people represents. Ignorance and not anti-Semitism is the greatest threat to us. And guys, as we're on Tisha B'av, we have the ability to comprehend all of this and sit back and look at our history, the good and the bad. Tisha B'av is all about looking at the bad things that happen and recognize that the prophecy is prophecy, the good will happen. I just want to end by reading you this incredible piece of Talmud from the tractate Makot, which you may be familiar with. And it was once that Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah and Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva were sending Jerusalem for the destruction of the temple. When they were after the destruction of the temple, remember this is 2nd century CE. When they arrived at Mount Scopus, which is where Hebrew University is, you can look down on the Temple Mount. They saw the site of the temple. They rent their garments in mourning. When they arrived in the Temple Mount, they saw a fox that emerged from the site of the Holy of Holies. They began weeping, and Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "For what reason are you weeping?" They said to him, "This is the place concerning which it is written, and a non-priest who approaches shall die." Like only the high priest was allowed into the Holy of Holies. On Yom Kippur, one day, and now a fox walks in it. Shall we not weep? Rabbi Akiva said, "That's why I'm laughing. In the prophecy of Uriah it was written, therefore, for your sake, Zion shall be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall be in rubble. And the Temple Mount will be a high place of forest, where foxes are found." There is a rabbinic tradition that this was prophesied by Uriah. In the prophecy of Zechariah it is written, there shall be yet elderly men and elderly women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem. Until the prophecy of Uriah with regards to the destruction of the city was fulfilled, I was afraid that the prophecy of Zechariah would not be fulfilled. Now that the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, it is evident that the prophecy of Zechariah remains valid. He just summed up our entire class. We saw the good and the bad happened. The bad stuff didn't have to happen, but the good stuff does have to happen, which is why the sages say to him, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. And right outside, I could walk 300 yards from here down to the Western Wall, a little south, and see the stones sitting on the street 2,000 years ago from the destruction of the Second Temple. It's an amazing thing to see. It's a moment of history frozen in time. If you look at where we are in history, we go back to my scenario of getting to the forest. We are the guys lying at the bottom of the mountain with time almost up, with our clothes shredded. We have made some very bad mistakes as Jews. We have paid a terrible price for them. Many of them were made in that period of time that led to the destruction of the First Temple, destruction of Second Temple, and many horrible things that came after. But it's in the past. We have our guidebook. We know the direction we're supposed to take. And now we have to sit and spend the hours we have left on Tisha B'av. I urge everyone to focus on what our mission is in history and to recognize that each of us, like a snowflake, is unique. And what can I do with my unique abilities, whether it's my ability to teach, my ability to impact people, whether it's my ability to give money to the right causes and institutions, what can we do to push this process forward? The finish line is in sight. And we have to also, the Second Temple was destroyed because of causeless hatred. We still live in the diaspora, as comfortable as it may be, caused by that Second Temple destruction. Sinat Chinam is still plaguing the Jewish people today. There are millions of people who hate us, yet we are arguing and fighting amongst ourselves. We have to make a paradigm shift to recognize we don't have to agree with each other, but you're my brother and my sister, and I got to love and respect you. And I got to bring out my own unique potential. And then maybe if just 10% of us as Jews work together, look what we've done and changed the world so far. We are so close. This is such a great opportunity. If just 10% of us can do that, then we can turn that day, Tisha B'av, which is supposed to be a happy day, but turn it to such a disastrous day. We'll change the karma, so to speak, flip it over again, and Tisha B'av, we're told, will be a day of great rejoicing. And then we will live to see the third temple. It should be built soon and in our days. And thank you so much. That was a massive amount of material. And I really appreciate you sticking with me. All my materials on my website, you're welcome to visit there. And you can also contact me through the website. You should all have an easy fast, and we should hear only good news, and all merit to be in Jerusalem with the temple rebuilt soon in our days. And this should be the last Tisha B'av that the Jewish people ever experience as a fast day. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Spiro, for those very, very inspiring words. I must say that the last part really resonates with me. Those that sometimes are laughing, those that are crying, I feel that Tisha B'av, please God, will all soon in our days be the ones that are going to see this as a tremendous day of celebration. And your words, please God, should be echoed. And please God, we should be able to all share in Simcha soon. Thank you for all the rabbis that joined in this process of unity and achdus, and wishing everyone an easy fast. And again, just to remind everyone of Rabbi Elephant speaking tomorrow at 11 o'clock. You can see the registration link on the chat. Thanks for all involved, and wishing you all a very good evening.